Um, let me just start. I usually we do this on the first class, but one of the things that people in the '60s started doing was when you begin a presentation, you kind of bare your soul and identify yourself. And I don't need to do that, but the reason I'm teaching this class actually isn't just because it's an academic interest to me. It's something I've actually done for a long time myself. I've been involved in a lot of political movements. Scott and I actually formed a group, which I think was, I would argue, the most important group in Houston for about 3 or 4 years, the Houston Global Awareness Collective. And we did a ton of stuff, ranging from a lot of stuff here on campus, teachings and educational presentations. That's the stuff I mostly did, to actually going in the streets and having demonstrations and protests. And Scott did a lot of that and still is. So I come at this not just as a scholar, but as somebody who's been involved and interested in it for a long time. I had a radio show, often did national feeds. I've been involved in all kinds of media stuff for a long, long time on various issues. I got started. One thing that really kind of radicalized me was that I was living in Washington, D.C., in the D.C. area in the 80s when the Reagan wars against El Salvador and Nicaragua, I don't know if you know anything about those, were raging. And so, along with my first wife, would often go downtown to Contra headquarters and protest, and was really involved in that. There was a group called the Pledge of Resistance. A lot of religious groups got involved in those movements against Reagan's policies in Central America. And from that point on, I did a lot of stuff on reproductive rights, going to helping NARAL and groups like that. And then in the more contemporary times, globalization issue, and then after 9/11, issues of war and national defense. I haven't done nearly as much lately, although I have done some stuff with the Occupy movements, especially in Austin, where I've gone a few times and talked. So, like I said, that's why I'm here, and that's one big reason I'm doing this class. And another good reason is you meet like some incredible people in it, and some people who I really cherish and have meant a ton to me, both politically, professionally, and personally. And the two folks we're having here today are like that. First up is going to be Scott Parker, who I've known for, I guess, about 10 years now, who was actually 12 years, who, like you, was sitting in a desk listening to this professor pontificate and rant and rave. And Scott had a day job here, but by night he was a Cape Crusader for peace and justice, and did a lot of stuff on that count. And we worked together extensively, and I think some real impressive stuff. Then about 6 years ago, he moved to San Francisco, where he currently works for Rainforest Action Network, RAN, as we do field organizer, campaigner. Okay. Senior campaigner. You're too young to be a senior anything, right? Scott's been involved in a lot of the major issues that you'll read about in the paper and in magazines like Rolling Stone. And most importantly, the issue of coal and knockout removal, climate change. And so he's going to talk a little bit about kind of what that means and kind of how it fits in the historical context. Then we're going to have somebody who's more locally oriented, who is, I would, to her embarrassment, call her a rising star in Houston, Amy Price. Amy ran for council. It was kind of, I would call it an insurgent campaign, and did quite well. And even more impressive, I think, and I think she would agree with me, is her work with Occupy Houston. She's really taken I won't say leadership role, because Occupy has no leaders, but she's taken on an incredibly important role there. And she's going to talk about kind of, I think, the local application of some of these bigger issues we're talking about. And so what I want you to do, though, is feel free to talk and ask questions. And I don't think you have to wait till they're done. If you have something, if they say something, raise your hand. And I'll probably be doing that too, because I really have this kind of more free form. All right. So we're going to start with Scott, and then Amy will come up. All right. The applause is in lieu of an honorarium, by the way.
Oh, okay.
You get the Jerry Brown called it psychic income.
Thanks, Bob. So, like Bob said, back in 2000, I was sitting probably in this classroom or another one, taking classes from Bob and other professors in the history department. I had, just to give a little bit of background, I kind of grew up in the very middle-class suburbs of Dallas. I'd gone to college at this state school in Mountain, North Carolina, where I'd gotten involved with a lot of like environmental politics and a bunch of hippie politics and stuff like that. Then I moved back to Texas and that was in North Carolina, and I moved back to Texas and went to grad school and got a degree in history, and then got a job, and I got engaged and all that sort of stuff. And then I started going back to graduate school, taking classes with Bob, and really was kind of moved by what was kind of happening in '99, 2000, things like that around issues of globalization. And the bug kind of bit me, and I kind of made some like significant shifts in my life. My day job that Bob was talking about was I actually worked for Continental Airlines. I worked in a business office, and really just kind of began to question a lot of what I was seeing, and that really kind of just combined with the stuff I was hearing in Bob's classes, combined with like some of the stuff I was seeing again really kind of happen in the United States and around the world, is when I decided like kind of start making some of these shifts in my life. And so now I live this really kind of underpaid, overworked, high pressure job to put pressure on Wall Street banks, banks like Bank of America and Citibank and Chase Manhattan to actually stop funding the coal industry. And it's not easy because banks like Bank of America are the biggest funder of coal industry in the world, really. But there's like kind of growing consciousness around issues of climate, around issues of extraction, around coal and tar sands oil and natural gas and things like that. And those are the folks I work with. And I wear a bunch of different hats. Besides working with the Rainforest Action Network, I also work with a group called Rising Tide North America, which I'll talk about a little bit in a minute. And then a third group called the Ruckus Society. Has anyone ever heard of the Ruckus Society? No? They are like a training group which trains young people, old people, people who are, activist-minded in tactics and techniques around nonviolent direct action or around nonviolent civil disobedience. And that's kind of some of the work in which I do is I actually go out and spend a lot of time working with people out in the field who are concerned about climate, concerned about social justice issues, and kind of teach them how to go do a sit-in or a blockade or things like that to kind of put their bodies on the line and really kind of challenge the power that a lot of these corporations and politicians have over our lives. And so the current state of radical protest. And so I'm going to actually talk a little bit about the history of some of the stuff that's kind of brought us to our current state, and then just talk about some of the ideas and the philosophies and stuff like that. And so current state of radical politics, this is actually a civil disobedience that we organized back in August in St. Louis. St. Louis is the headquarters to Peabody Coal, which is the largest coal company in the world. Coal is bad because it's actually the largest contributor of greenhouse gases, which is leading to catastrophic climate change. Also, companies like Peabody are pretty responsible for devastating extraction processes where they are poisoning people's water, poisoning people's air, removing people, kicking people out of their homes and things like that. And a lot of these coal companies are actually responsible for that. But this is a sit-in at an intersection in front of Peabody's headquarters where about 15 people actually got arrested in doing this. Direct action. How many people have heard the term direct action? Anybody? Anyone know what I'm talking about with direct action? No? Okay. So kind of direct action is like the underlying theme that is in today's social justice and environmental movements. And there's a couple different ways to look at direct action. There's where we look at it tactically, and that's where I'm talking about like the sit-ins, the occupations, and things like that. There's also where we look at it philosophically, and that's where we're really kind of trying to challenge some of the powers that be. The way the political system in the United States is set up right now is the way in which we kind of work politically is we elect people to go to Washington or to go to Austin or go to City Hall and basically represent us and kind of mediate things with the business sector, the private sector, people in other countries and things like that. And currently the way the system's set up is it's very skewed towards who really has a lot of control over what the politicians are doing and saying. The corporations, right, the business sector. And so what the kind of movements I've been involved with since like 2000 that Bob and I kind of started working with are people who have been challenging that. In 99, 2000, it was kind of a movement where we were being very critical of corporations and governments basically telling people in global south countries what they can do and what they can't do, trying to impact their labor standards, their safety standards, their environmental standards, and things like that. And now that corporate influence is spread from not just trying to take away those safety standards, those labor standards, those environmental standards for people in the global south, but now it's also moved into the United States. And that's actually a lot of what Amy will talk about, because that's what the Occupy movement is. It's really kind of challenging the corporations trying to privatize all of this stuff, not just abroad, but at home. But the kind of philosophical, back to that philosophical roots of direct action are that we don't actually want to ask politicians to go out and make change for us. We actually go out and make change ourselves. And so we run campaigns against corporations. And the work that I do is I go out and organize people to kind of take action against banks. We do protests out in front of the banks. We do letter writing campaigns. We do all kinds of creative online things to call out the banks. We kind of go and work with people in communities that are really impacted by this, their practices. The kind of one of the main ones where I've been working the last few years has been in Appalachia. And we work with those folks to kind of like do media, to get the word out, to tell people's stories, and to kind of influence public opinion so that, and make the kind of connections that you're not actually really seeing in the media unless the media is being kind of pressured to tell the story the way we want it told, or in my opinion, told accurately. And just real quick with the Appalachia stuff, because that's been a lot of my work. Are people familiar with a process called mountaintop removal coal mining? Could somebody tell me what that is?
So they blast off the top of one of these little Appalachian mountains and they mine down into it, and all of the leftover gets into the streams and basically blocks up the entire ecosystem.
Right, and they're doing that because where they used to do deep underground mining, and y'all probably talk about that because there's a long history of unionization and labor struggle around that, is that all that coal in Appalachia is run out. So all that's left are these seams that are about 200 feet under the top of the mountain. So the coal companies strip it off. It's also more profitable to do it like that, and they just kind of scrape it off. And so there's been actually a pretty big movement to stop mountaintop removal coal mining for the last 10 years, and it's really kind of hit ahead in the last 5 or 6 years. And we, the organization I work with, Rainforest Action Network, has actually done a lot to put pressure on these big corporate Wall Street banks that fund those coal companies. And those coal companies are bad players. And you talk about feudalism. In Appalachia, it's a feudal economy. It's a mono economy, and most of the people who live in that region, either they work for the coal industry or their family works for the coal industry, or maybe they work in like a service sector job that basically sells goods to people in the coal industry. The heads of the coal companies basically rule the area like feudal lords. There's one in particular, a guy named Don Blankenship, who, Central Casting they would have loved him as a villain. I mean, he did everything but twirl his mustache for the cameras. And my organization actually ran a campaign to get the banks to stop funding companies like Massey, and I call Massey, that was Don's company, the poster child of mountaintop removal coal. We've actually gotten policies or had significant movement from 8 different Wall Street banks. Actually, 6 Wall Street banks and 2 European banks to stop funding mountaintop removal. We've got the 4 largest banks in the United States, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citibank, and Chase, to stop funding Massey itself. And at the end of last year, Don Blankenship actually stepped down as CEO because there was so much pressure on him. There was another piece, which was there was a pretty bad mining disaster about a year and a half ago in West Virginia, where 29 miners died in an explosion. There's also a lot of corruption. There's a lot of where they pay off inspectors. There's where they hide a lot of what's going on in the mines to the inspectors. And so, he basically killed those people based on their practices, kind of obscuring safety practices. So Don was kind of put out of business last December, and this year Massey, which was in financial crisis, was actually taken over by another company. But we actually feel like we can take some credit because we actually got some of these big banks to stop funding Massey. But back to direct action. Like I said, it's the kind of underlying theme in a lot of these movements, and we want to we want to confront these corporations ourselves, and that's kind of like what's been going on with a lot of these movements. And it's more of a philosophy than just the tactics. And you can look at the tactics, and you can see people going to marches, you can see people going to protests, you can see people putting their bodies on the line and doing civil disobedience. But when we really start talking about who holds power in our country and how we can change that, we can also talk about how that's our power analysis, our direct action power analysis. Any questions so far?
Massey also just had a $200 million. Is that a court judgment or a government fine?
It was I actually believe it was a settlement.
So,
It was a settlement, and so Massey, which is now actually owned and operated by a company called Alpha Natural Resources, agreed to pay the families of most of those miners $200 million to drop the civil suit or settle the civil suit with that. And part of the agreement actually was there would be no criminal charges against Alpha Natural Resources, and so there's no criminal liability now for Alpha executives who have taken on the kind of the baggage of Massey Energy. And there's still some cases where like Massey foremen and management and actually their chief of security are getting like indicted by the federal government. Their chief of security for that mine actually got indicted by the feds for basically covering up what was actually happening, kind of blocking the investigation. Yeah.
When Messi got bought out, did their CEOs or whatever, these people at the top, did they transfer over into this new company, or did they?
It's a merger.
It's a merger. So basically, these people just completely got out of most of the problems they would have by being bought out. Is that what is happening?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So they settled with the civil suit,
Right.
and then Massey executives have gotten immunity from criminal prosecution, but the people who aren't the top executives, like the chief of security at that mine, are still getting criminal charges. So, and then Don Blankenship got a golden parachute, and he's not going to have any criminal liability. There's a story that came out just the last week or two that he's actually about to get by another coal company in Kentucky. Because he's such a lovely guy. Yeah.
When you go for one of your demonstrations, do you guys advocate an alternative energy source in response to coal?
Let me actually talk about the next thing, and it'll kind of answer that a little bit. Within direct action organizing, we advocate a dual power organizing model where we talk about resist and create. Okay, and so about 90% of what we work on is like resistance stuff. And we actually see ourselves as people who are trying to change the conversation through some of these protest and resistance tactics. There's a lot of organizations, there's scientists, there's folks like that who actually advocate alternatives, and we often adopt some of that language and stuff like that. But we're not scientists, and we're not even. I actually don't even really consider us policymakers, but we kind of basically just try to raise awareness about these issues. And so there are alternatives that we promote, but we don't spend a lot of time kind of focusing on that. We're an environmental protest group, and that's something that's kind of sorely lacking. But with the dual power organizing, about 90% of what we do, and many groups like us do, and there's a whole network of groups like that out there, we advocate the resistance, making a stink about things, doing what you might call an eco stunt, which I'll have some pictures of as we kind of go through the presentation. On the create side of kind of direct action organizing, dual power organizing, there have been a lot of projects out there which kind of push for ways to kind of challenge corporate power, not by protest or resistance or anything like that, but by kind of building some sort of alternative. A really good example of this is after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, a lot of activists and anarchists, which I kind of identify as an anarchist, and a lot of these movements I work with are anarchist movements, actually went to New Orleans in the wake of the kind of chaos and actually stayed for a long time and formed an organization called Common Ground. After Katrina, a lot of the government efforts to kind of provide relief and help people kind of fell apart, at least in the beginning. And even like the kind of bigger groups like the Red Cross actually were a little bit like paralyzed with what to do. And so there was like a kind of call amongst like activist groups and anarchist groups to actually go and do solidarity, particularly with like the kind of poor black communities there, which were not only under attack because their homes were underwater, but there was lots of white racist groups, which were white racist individuals, which were like riding through some of these black neighborhoods and shooting people. There's a little bit of little armed struggle going on in New Orleans after Katrina, and so these folks went to kind of provide support and solidarity and work with the local community. But out of common ground, not only were they doing relief and kind of self-defense work, but they were also doing, they started like a food distribution center. They started a health clinic. They did a lot of things like where they would do these projects where they would go in the neighborhoods and basically homes that had been consumed by mold from the water, they would gut those homes and kind of help clean them up. They reclaimed schools, which the city was trying to shut down. There's a lot of politics around, you know, people being able to come back into their homes who had to flee. And, you know, the city actually didn't want the poor people to come back because it kind of felt like they were a blight. And so instead what they did was they tried to kind of keep them out. And what the Common Ground folks did was they actually tried to make space for them to be able to come back to their homes. Another good example of this is just like community gardens, one I like to talk about with the Create piece, which is we spend a lot of money at grocery stores, at these big mega grocery stores like your Kroger Signature store, and I noticed the big HEB complex which they put over near River Oaks kind of blows me away. I lived in Houston for a long time, but I've been gone for 6 years, and to see the changes just happening in places like Montrose is amazing. But community gardens is actually in agribusiness too. But community gardens is something where people kind of take those dollars that you would spend at Kroger or HEB or Whole Foods, and you basically kind of like create your own food source, at least on a limited basis. And so we actually see that as a form of direct action. The other thing I want to talk about with direct action is what we call the dilemma decision, and this is more at the tactical level. And so all the groups I work with actually have very strong guidelines around nonviolence, and there's some direct action groups which don't have strong guidelines around nonviolence, but we actually see nonviolence as the really effective strategy to really kind of like put pressure on power holders. And with the dilemma decision, what we do is if we do a sit-in, we're doing a sit-in in ExxonMobil's headquarters, then the dilemma in which we're given the authorities is that they can either take us out, either they have to forcibly remove us, or they can let us sit there, right? Those are the two options they have. And if they take us out and forcibly remove us, it makes them somewhat violent. It makes them usually have to arrest us, which gets us media, which is one of the reasons that we do these sorts of things. But if they leave us there, then we've kind of won. And so kind of like the kind of underlying strategy around direct action is we kind of create this crisis and kind of give them the dilemma decision. And one of the things that we say in our trainings, and like I said, I'm a trainer around these sorts of tactics, is that the more nonviolent and the more vulnerable we make ourselves, that's where we're going to see the state and the authorities acting more violently. Have y'all also been seeing some of the video and pictures from some of the Occupy movement? Did y'all see the video from UC Davis? Mm-hmm. Right? And so those are kids who are just like sitting there, you know, sitting in there non-violently, and then that police lieutenant just comes up and just like, right? And so they have put themselves in a non-violent position where they're looking vulnerable, and he comes up and reacts with like a maximum amount of force, like non-lethal force, but still a maximum amount of force. I should actually put that picture in this presentation, but that's actually a really good example of that. And one of the things that resulted from that UC Davis video and that story that kind of came out a couple weeks ago was that actually built more momentum for the Occupy movement. And I've kind of seen peaks and valleys with the Occupy movement where it seems like it has a really large amount of momentum, and then it kind of has a lull, and then usually there's some level of police brutality, and it spikes it back up again. So, are there any questions? Yeah.
Well, you're obviously working in an environment,
Mm-hmm.
but like, does your group ever think about like how the people that work for the company feel about it?
All the time.
Okay.
Appalachia is actually a really good example of, so jobs is the issue. So it's always the jobs versus the environment issue, which I actually consider to be a bit of a false dichotomy. You can actually have both. So like I said, Southern West Virginia in particular is a place where we have a mono economy around the coal industry. But with the coal industry actually are the ones who have destroyed the jobs in Appalachia. And so they've done that by basically kind of shifting the emphasis from deep underground mining to this kind of mountaintop removal mining. It's a lot more mechanization. It's a lot more. It's a lot less jobs because one person can do the job that 20 people did. And the stat that I always throw out there is that in 1950 there were 150,000 miners in West Virginia, and today there's less than 20,000 people who are like working on extracting coal, right? there's actually a stat that the groups in Appalachia threw out. There's actually more florists in West Virginia than there are miners, than people who extract coal.
Well, I asked because you mentioned ExxonMobil,
Mm-hmm.
and both my mom and my stepdad work for ExxonMobil.
Mhm.
So like, if you're sitting there like in the way or whatever, like you're preventing them from doing a job.
Right. Right. And so, that's a good question, and I would say that we take that into account, and we also think as we're looking at catastrophic climate change, we're seeing rising sea levels, we're seeing communities which are being devastated by extractive processes, things like that. That someone not being able to go to their job for a day is kind of worth that at that moment, because we feel like we need to raise awareness about this sort of thing. So,
Yeah.
answer your question.
I was just wondering.
Yeah, no worries. And we actually also, in our trainings, actually prepare people a lot for those sorts of situations. And so, kind of to do a little, because I was actually a history teacher too, because when I was taking grad classes with Bob, I also was teaching at San Jacinto College, part-time in the evenings. And so I want to throw a little bit of a history lesson in here on this stuff. And so I'm going to talk about the three kind of more contemporary movements which really kind of led us here. The first is the anti-nuclear movement. And this is a picture from a place called Seabrook, New Hampshire in the late 70s. And so anti-nuclear movement, in the early 1970s, the Nixon administration actually came up with an energy plan, and their goal was to put 100 new nuclear power plants online in the United States by 2000. And so with what's kind of coming out of the 1960s at the time, there's a big anti-war movement, there's a big kind of like consciousness around nuclear energy. And then we also during the 1960s have a growing consciousness around environmentalism. Y'all probably talk about this as you go along, but there's a woman named Rachel Carson who wrote a book called Silent Spring, which really triggered the modern environmental movement. And so the kind of heyday for the anti-nuclear movement is the 1970s and 1980s, throughout the anti-war and new environmental movements. And so what the anti-nuclear movement wanted to do was monkey wrench this Nixon this Nixon energy plan. And so what they did was, using like a lot of kind of anarchist organizing models, organized mass protests at Seabrook, which is a town in New Hampshire, on the coast of New Hampshire, where they were actually building a nuclear power plant. And 1976, 1977, 1978, they actually had mass protests at Seabrook, where people were going and jumping the fence and going and committing civil disobedience on the site of the background music, where they were going and building this nuclear power plant. The first year, for instance, 2,000 people got arrested, were detained for 2 weeks in army barracks. Actually, one of my coworkers was one of those people. He was 18. He got arrested with his mom, who was a Quaker. And I should say, there's actually a lot of religious traditions which are involved with this, and the Quakers in particular are a group which have like kind of been involved with this stuff since the days of abolition. 1981, there was a mass march in New York where over 1 million people marched against nuclear power. And then 1986 into the early 90s, there were people doing this sort of these actions in Nevada where they did a lot of testing of nuclear power. Yeah.
Let me say something because it's something I haven't brought up yet. You don't have to mention that. In 1979, there was also the worst nuclear accident in
Yes.
U.S. history.
3 Mile Island.
Pennsylvania, 3 Mile Island, and that's something we're going to see time and again where movements kind of coalesce around this kind of, what you may call an opportune moment in the Vietnam War. But, you have situations like that, like, the Occupy movement has a lot to do with the crash in 2008, the banking crisis, and the bailout. The Vietnam War, obviously, doesn't just create any more movement. It becomes like a conveyor belt for all these other movements. So, a lot of times, even if there's not a strong organization in place, something will happen that will create this kind of spontaneous uprising and coalesce around that and actually form these kind of radical movements too. And 3 Mile Island.
Yeah, I was actually going to mention 3 Mile Island.
No, I wasn't sure. I just wanted to kind of put it in the bigger context of that kind of opportune moment.
The contemporary term we use to describe that thing is a psychic break. And so something like 3 Mile Island, where there's like the kind of more devoted activists, the Quakers, the anarchist groups and things like that are doing all this stuff at Seabrook, but then 3 Mile Island happens and it kind of builds this bigger consciousness. And it's a break psychically, where people feel like they've been being told by the people in power one thing, and then all of a sudden we have this like terrible nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island. It's like, hey, what they've been telling us the whole time is actually BS. 2000 March 2003, there was a lot of people around the country who actually had that psychic break moment when George Bush decided to invade Iraq, and you know, we were on the streets here in Houston, all over the country, all over the world. People were like responding to that. Any questions? No? So another one, this is kind of where some of my roots in activism come from, is a group called Earth First. Who here has heard of Earth First? Anyone want to? The one person raise their hand. Who is Earth First?
I've heard of them. I just know that it's an ecological action
Right.
network. I can't tell you a lot about it. I've heard of it.
Okay, no worries. So Earth First was founded in 1981, and so there's actually institutions since the 1960s, or even before the 1960s, which work on conservation, environmental protection, things like that. We're talking about groups like the Sierra Club and Environmental Defense, and so on and so forth. And these actually are groups that operate a lot in the Beltway in Washington, D.C. And they work with lobbyists, they have their own lobbyists, they work with legislators, and they look for ways to kind of protect things from like the federal government, so it's like kind of top down. And so Earth First were a bunch of, they called themselves Rednecks for the Environment, or Buckaroos. And they were actually people who worked for these organizations in states like Montana and Wyoming, working on wilderness protection. And they were becoming increasingly frustrated with the amount of compromise that these kind of bigger green groups were doing with industry and with the federal government. And actually on a weekend where they went off on a kind of like a drinking weekend to go camp out in the Sonoran Desert, they were coming back and they were talking about their frustrations. And they said, what we need to do is form a group to have a more no compromise position on this wilderness protection, on this forest protection. And just be clear, what they see as like real victory is numbers of acres saved from development. And so they're riding in a VW bus back from this camping trip in Mexico, and one of them said Earth First, and that's when they kind of launched their movement. Their heyday is in the 1980s and the 1990s. The thing about Earth First, the thing about the environmental movement and Earth First is the 1980s and 1990s was a period where we saw a lot of like kind of environmental struggle around forest protection. Big logging companies were, logging old growth redwoods, old growth forests, Northern California, Washington, Oregon, places like that. And Earth First really kind of decided to take a stand there. They were founded, like I said, on the notion of no compromise in defense of Mother Earth. And what they did was they kind of had really amongst the environmental movement, really kind of took this notion of environmental protest and environmental action to a whole new level. And so, how many folks here have ever heard of a tree sit? Everyone ever seen the episode of The Simpsons where Lisa actually goes and sits in a tree sit because she meets this really cool, rad environmental guy who works with a group called Dirt First, right? So Earth First is like really kind of spread into like our cultural consciousness a little bit through shows like The Simpsons. There was actually a Jurassic Park movie where there was an Earth Firster as well, played by Vince Vaughn. It's quite ironic because he's a Republican. But so what Earth First does is they actually take direct action, and they kind of are able to take their political position and transform that into action, right? They have their theory, and then they transform that into action. And the other phrase that we really associate with Earth First is direct action gets the goods. And there's a whole kind of subculture, and they have a magazine they put out called the Earth First Journal, and they're still around, and they still do a lot of work. Watershed moments within the Earth First movement is that Earth First was founded in 1981. In 1990, probably their really most peak moment is that they actually there was a woman who got involved with Earth First in Northern California. Her name was Judy Berry. And she actually was a labor organizer who became concerned about the plight of what was going on with the redwoods. And so she actually kind of, working with other Earth Firsters, came up with this notion of Redwood Summer. How many people here, y'all haven't talked about Mississippi Summer yet?
No.
For Freedom Summer. But so basically Judy Berry wanted to take the idea of what they did in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement with Freedom Summer and transform it to Northern California around the redwoods, and they call it Redwood Summer. And this is happening around the time where I'm like 20 years old, and I'm a college student in this North Carolina college, and was very much like enthralled with what was going on out there. And it was a very powerful moment, and we had thousands of college students and thousands of environmentally conscious people going and basically doing civil disobedience around these issues in Northern California, Oregon, Washington, places like that. In 1990, Judy Berry is in Oakland, California with her partner, a guy named Daryl Cherney, and they're in a car, and all of a sudden the car explodes, and someone had planted a bomb in their car. They survived, but they were both put in the hospital, right? And so while they're in the hospital, the FBI comes in and arrests them and said that they planted the bomb on themselves. And it became a very powerful story, and actually something of a very powerful organizing tool. They kind of used it to deter Redwood Summer, but in a lot of ways, it kind of really helped push the forest movement even up that much further. Judy actually died in 1997 of breast cancer, but she and Daryl had actually sued the FBI for wrongful prosecution, and in 2002, the heirs of Judy Berry and Daryl Charney actually won a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the FBI for the wrongful prosecution, and to this day, they've never solved the bombing. The kind of theory is that there was probably people who were like sympathetic to the industry who like planted it, and it went off. The FBI actually said they planted the bomb on themselves, so which doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Also, with Judy Berry, kind of the question you asked earlier, coming out of labor, she actually, more than I think anybody in that era,
In that movement.
yeah, to work with labor as well. And I think that's why she's particularly frightening to the lumber industry, because she didn't create this dichotomy between jobs and the environment. She said, you can work with both, and she actually was, had a lot of support among lumber
Loggers.
unions and things like that. And I think, I would agree with Scott that that was not a coincidental bombing, that, she was targeted. And I think in particular that's why, because she was a threat, because she was putting together the environment along with the class.
Yeah. And she was very much like a working class hero
Yeah.
sort of person. She started out as like a machinist.
Sure, he's still performing, isn't he?
Yeah, yeah. Back on Earth First. The other couple things I'll say about Earth First really quick is that there are there's like 5 or 6 guys who were in that van coming back from the Sonoran Desert, and one of them who is really associated as like the main founder of Earth First is a guy named Dave Foreman, who actually had a background in anthropology, and he had kind of like, these guys have actually really been, they were not only kind of over the institutional green groups, which compromised, they were also over kind of like the old left. And so he actually was looking for a way to make this more of a kind of cultural phenomenon. And so they kind of built this Earth First culture, which included music and poetry and a warrior bravado around the direct action stuff, which is actually a little bit kind of off-putting at times. And really kind of built it like that. And that's why I actually think that's one of the reasons that Earth First has really kind of prevailed. Every summer they have what they call the Round River Rendezvous in different parts of the country. I actually went to it back in July. And it's very much about this like kind of like cultural thing of being an Earth Firster. And it's not an organization, it's more of a kind of decentralized movement which kind of like grows up in certain places and kind of ebbs and flows. And it's also an international movement. They have Earth First chapters in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, places like that, South America. And so it's something that's much more than just like a single organization. In 1996, the other really significant thing I wanted to mention, I'm going to finish the founder thing. So Dave Foreman actually has kind of been also thrown out of Earth First, or really disassociated with Earth First. He actually has a lot of like really strong anti-immigrant positions now around environmental stuff, and so current people in Earth First don't really like him. The other kind of significant co-founder of Earth First that I want to mention is a guy named Mike Roselle. And so Roselle went on to found my organization, Rainforest Action Network, as well as the group where I sit on the board, which is the Ruckus Society. And Roselle is very much about building direct action movements and building direct action networks around the country. He actually lives in West Virginia now and has been kind of waging a campaign to end mountaintop removal using direct action tactics since like 2008. And he is one of those kind of iconic godfather figures, iconic elders of the direct action movement in the United States, still with us today. So the third kind of really influential movement I want to talk about is the anti-corporate globalization movement. This is the stuff that Bob and I was doing about 10, 12 years ago. And its heyday was in the 1990s and 2000, and it was a global movement. We actually, a lot of us refer to it as a movement of movements. And basically, as we're talking about privatization and austerity and the power that corporations and big banks have over us today with the Occupy movement, the global justice movement, the anti-corporate globalization movement, like 10, 12 years ago, was talking about that in regards to the measures, the austerity, privatization measures they were kind of imposing on the rest of the, on poorer countries, global south countries around the world. And they actually were in the process of developing these kind of transnational economic institutions. And has anyone ever heard of the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, or the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, or the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or the Free Trade Area of the Americas? These were all initiatives that mostly global North countries and elites in the global South countries were really kind of pushing on the rest of the world to have like this kind of unifying economic model. And so the anti-corporate globalization movement really kind of like rose up as an alternative to that and a resistance movement to that. The real watershed moments within the corporate globalization movement was in 1994 in the Mexican state of Chiapas, where a group of activists, revolutionaries, whatever you want to use to term them, the Mexican government probably called some terrorists, called the Zapatistas, actually rose up after NAFTA was actually implemented in Mexico, because NAFTA was actually devastating to indigenous communities and poor communities all through Mexico. And the Zapatista uprising actually was very much, in my opinion, what launched the kind of anti-corporate globalization movement, which like would evolve over the next 10 years after this. And lots of anti-globalization activists really see the Zapatistas as role models in this. Is anyone, are folks here familiar with the Zapatistas or heard of the Zapatistas? Yeah? Subcomandante Marcos, he's the guy you see on the ski mask sitting on the horse smoking his pipe through his mask, right? He was actually a Marxist professor in Mexico City who actually spent 10, 12 years organizing in Chiapas with indigenous communities and poor communities before they kind of launched the Zapatista uprising. Other watershed moments is that kind of the Zapatista uprising spreads to Europe, and there's a lot of mobilizations around these kind of big conferences and convergence where these corporations and elites and government officials are meeting, trying to sort out this kind of government, this world government program for the economy. And that leads to 1999, with the World Trade Organization shut down Seattle. People familiar with this? People heard of this? How many people here saw the movie Battle in Seattle? Anyone see that? Really? That's good, because it's a really bad movie. Woody Harrelson's in it, not my favorite actor. Charlize Theron, like her a lot more. But so this protest that happens in November 1999 is the World Trade Organization. It was going to be like one of their really big meetings where they go solidify a lot what they did. And in the Northwest United States, social movements, Earth First groups, anarchist groups, civil disobedience groups, religious groups, labor, human rights, the anti-sweatshop movement, all of these kind of groups kind of converge together, converge at once. And they actually do a mass direct action around the convention center in Seattle where this meeting is going on. This is actually a banner hang. We did this a few days before the big protests happened. You'll notice that that's Rainforest Action Network, which is doing the banner hang. The message is democracy is going one way and the WTO is going the other. And that was a big critique of this kind of anti-corporate globalization movement, is that there's no democratic process going on. It was just politicians and lobbyists and elites which were really kind of like dictating what the economic plan was going to be for the rest of the world. And in my business, where we do campaign work, and we do this kind of guerrilla campaign work, we actually call this a framing action. And so when it hit the media, and it hit the newsstands, what was going on, we put this is the image that we broadcast to the world, and it's a really simple message, and it says it all right there, right? Democracy is going one way, and the WTO is going the other. What happens in the streets, this happened this happened about a week before the actual protests, and what happens in the streets is that thousands of people are pre-organized into groups to do blockades of the 13 streets that go into the Seattle Convention Center. And people basically they're putting their bodies on the line, and they're like chaining themselves to each other. And then probably 50,000 people were in Seattle that day from all over the world. Lots of labor to kind of like protest the WTO. And the thing about it is that the groups which were doing the civil disobedience of the intersections were able to pull those people, and so it was like this kind of swarming thing. And the police were unable to break up these blockades. And it was a very powerful moment. The delegates couldn't get in. And what that did was that opened up an opportunity for delegates from the global South country, the people who are going to be on the receiving end of the kind of bad privatization policies, to begin to kind of like resist within the meetings, resist within the procedure, to really kind of monkey wrench the WTO. And by the third or fourth day, I forget which one it was, of the protests, and when the meeting was supposed to go on, the WTO, the head of the WTO, basically came out and said, we have to cancel these meetings because we're unable to continue with the protests outside and with the protests inside. And so that was one of the things that really kind of, it's what we at RAND we call it an inside-outside strategy, right? So you have people who are doing protest and direct action out on the street, and then you have people inside who are being really tough on the negotiation and really tough within the procedure stuff, and even doing their own forms of civil resistance within the internal part. Yeah.
What type of organization or communication between the outside and the inside?
So there's what's the best way to say this? So there's a lot of organizations out there which are like non-governmental organizations which work on human rights, they work on economic justice, they work on labor, they work on environmental stuff. And so a lot of representatives within these meetings are people who kind of come out of these social movements and who are like very much tied in with the networks on the outside.
So no formal time, but a lot of personal ties, probably?
Yeah, I would also say,
Like Evo Morales was actually formerly that.
yeah, yeah, and actually, like, Bob and I actually work with a nonprofit, sometimes still do, called Global Exchange. And the people who work with Global Exchange are actually inside, also doing protests and impacting things like
One
that.
thing, I mean, it's not at Seattle, but one thing that a lot of corporate actors do is they'll buy shares.
Mhm.
They'll buy a few shares in a company so they can get into the stock or from 1 or 2 there. It's like 5-10 more minutes.
Yeah, I'm almost done. Real quick, the thing about this kind of organizing that we kind of all participate in is it's network organizing, and so it's not like formal alliances between organizations, but it's like where people are in social networks and they're in like kind of like activist networks where there's a lot of overlap and a lot of communication going on like that. Real quick, the other two significant moments is that the bank globalization movement was actually had a lot of momentum until September 11th, 2001, and that kind of shut down our momentum a lot and really was like somewhat crushing. We were actually planning to have a really big protest in DC later that month, which Bob and I had organized about 40 or 50 people from Houston to go to. Not just Bob and I, it was a whole group of people. And that really kind of like completely shut down the corporate globalization movement.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of literature on how Vietnam really kind of monkeyed into the civil rights movement. Because Vietnam became really rich. I mean, locally, remember, we had a bunch of stuff planned.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we had this whole series of events, like we had like 2 months of stuff, and we just, made the transition to become an anti-war movement, which is what happened. There a lot of actors were dealing with stuff in 1963 and 1964, and all of a sudden, boom, the war escalated and became an anti-war movement,
Right.
which in retrospect was a mistake.
The last hurrah of the corporate globalization movement in the United States is in November of 2003, where there's a big protest around the free trade area of the Americas, which is another one of these agreements in Miami. The Miami Police Department actually adopted a lot of the same sort of tactics that the U.S. military adopted in Iraq and the Israeli military adopted in Palestine to use against us. It was pretty intense. The new movements, I'm going to go through these really quick. The new movements, one of which I'm part of, is the climate movement. And this is where we're linking communities fighting against extraction in places like Appalachia and Alberta. Alberta is the place they're doing all this tar sands oil. They're doing all this tar sands oil extraction. It links those groups. It links the more liberal NGOs and student movements, which are like pursuing policy to do something about climate change, which actually doesn't really seem to be working. Climate legislation failed last year. International multilateral agreements around climate have also been failing in places like Copenhagen and Durban, where the UN meets about these sorts of things. And then it also links more radical groups which work on climate, like Earth First, and this group I work with called Rising Tide. This is actually a picture of a sit-in from the Department of Interior back in April, where Rising Tide took about 300 students and environmental activists and did a massive sit-in at the Department of Interior. Department of Interior is oversees agencies which are responsible for things like mountaintop removal and offshore oil drilling and coal leases in Wyoming. I'm going to move on to the next one really quick. This is actually just a picture of mountaintop removal. Actually, probably it's not the right place for the presentation. Then the Occupy movement, I'm going to let Amy talk about that, but you can see the slide of the Occupied Wall Street Journal. And so then there's the last thing, which is something that Bob and I have been talking about, but we're talking a lot about within the kind of action movement or action networks in which I work in, which are people who kind of go outside the box. And so it's kind of the power holders, as far as like people who oppose what they do, have a certain calculus where they factor it in. It's one of the reasons that Bush was able to go into Iraq, even though there were millions of people on the street, because they actually factored that there was going to be mass protests against what they were doing. And so these two gentlemen are people who have actually kind of gone outside of that calculus. And y'all are probably more familiar with Bradley Manning. Does everyone know who Bradley Manning is? Bradley Manning is the person who leaked a lot of State Department files to WikiLeaks. He's actually in jail in like some really harsh solitary confinement, and he's like facing life in prison. But it's like kind of let out a lot of information that some of which probably wasn't really that significant, but just kind of scared the powers that be that someone leaked all this stuff. The Obama administration in particular has waged a war against whistleblowers and leakers. One thing about the information that Bradley Manning leaked was that it actually helped spark some of the kind of people uprisings going on in the Middle East. The ones in Tunisia, the information kind of talked a lot about like the corruption of the regime at the time and things like that. The other one is a friend of mine who's actually very known in the climate movement. His name is Tim DeChristopher. And Tim DeChristopher about 3 years ago actually went into a federal oil and gas lease auction. And he actually just went in to protest or scream or make some kind of like ruckus. But he was asked actually if he was going to be a bidder in the auction. He said, sure. And so what he did was he started bidding wars, even though he didn't have the money, with the oil and gas men, and basically monkey wrenched the entire auction. And he kept doing it, like bid on millions of dollars worth of lands in southern Utah, which they were gonna like. So this is beautiful southern red rock wilderness in Utah that they were gonna basically drill and destroy for oil and gas. And so Tim is a person of conscience, like a true person of conscience that I've met in this work. And so Tim monkey wrenched it to the point where the federal marshals took him out a few months later. And so that was December of 2008. His legal strategy at that point was that when we switch from Bush to Obama, they'll probably just drop the charges. Obama actually has been pretty harsh. Again, his Justice Department's been pretty harsh against him. And so actually Tim got convicted of 2 felonies back in March and was taken into custody in July and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. So he sees himself as a civil disobedience activist who kind of went outside of what was really a standard by the environmental movement and the environmental action movement. The other thing about Tim is that he cost millions of dollars, and they actually just canceled the entire auction, and that gave enough time for the lawyers to actually get legal protections in place where they've not drilled that wilderness. And so it's a very powerful kind of thing. Tim is very much like a leader and popular figure in the climate movements. And then, so that's the end of my presentation. This is actually an action I organized at a utility company in Richmond, Virginia, with an Earth First group, and they blocked the road going into the building to kind of raise awareness about what's going on. They're called Blue Ridge Earth First, and the kind of message says, "Oh, we won't stop until you do." That's it. And if you're interested, I have some brochures of Rising Tide, which is a group I work with. I'm going to take them. I even have a sign-up sheet. I'm just going to check here.
I mentioned Amy, we're talking about the run for council and even more about the Occupy movement. Would you? No, go ahead.
I'm Amy Price, and a year ago I changed my name, so I had not done anything before. Now that I've run for office, still nobody knows my name because nobody's involved in the case. So I wanted to start off with kind of my personal story. had one campaigns, a long time ago, I figured out, just like a whole bunch of people did, that our government was not run by people, it was run by corporations. And my response to this was not to go out and get involved. I think I was so overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of whatever had to be done that I turned inward. And my response was, I became vegetarian, I tried to buy ethically, it was very personal and not terribly effective, but that's how I dealt with it. And so about a year ago, I kind of couldn't stand that anymore. I decided I just had to get more involved in the world, and that led me personally to the Green Party. I had read the 10 key values a long time ago. I was on board with all of them, it made sense to me, so that's kind of how I got started trying to be more involved in my community and my world. And I got asked by some members in the party to run locally, and first I said no because I'm not stupid, but then I thought about it, and it's trite, but it's true. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So I said, okay, fine, I've complained so much, now I need to do something about it. So I started running, and that led me to Occupy. I had no idea what I was doing running for office. I'd never done it before, and the Green Party, our hearts are in the right places, we're tiny and we're not terribly well organized, so I couldn't really, I didn't get a whole lot of structure and support from my local party because they just didn't have to give. But I had a fantastic campaign manager, student Bob's, who said, you need to go to this meeting. And I said, okay. And I showed up, and what it was the very first meeting of what would come to be Occupy Houston. This is before the march downtown, before any of this happened. So I sat in on that. I started to get a little bit involved. And in mid-October, we had a march coming from one park down to in front of City Hall. And that was the official beginning of Occupy Houston. And that, I am told, for Houston was pretty darn successful. We got about 300 people out. And I don't have experience organizing in different cities or different parts of the country, but 300 people is pretty good for Houston, right? So that was kind of our success number one. I'd say our success number two was an event we had about a month later, a divestment march, and this was a kind of a national thing. This was coordinated. Coordinated is probably not the right word, but there was basically a divestment day suggested on Facebook, and a lot of occupations signed on. And we held a divestment march and had about 200 people. And the idea was we went from bank to bank downtown and had people close out their accounts. And I read that in the first quarter of this year, more people moved their accounts from large corporate banks to community-based banks and savings and loans and things like that than happened during the entire year of the last fiscal year. So I think things are going in a good direction with that. It's a little hard to talk about the Occupy movement definitively because we're at this point a loose coalition of occupations. And I think everybody has their own mission statement. The mission statement of Occupy Houston is to end corporate corruption of democracy. It's pretty broad, and it includes a lot of things. But that much, at least, I think pretty much everybody is on board with, all the different occupations are on board with. And I think, so far, Occupy has been successful in doing three broad things. One is drawing the public eye to what our government is capable of in terms of sort of police brutality and everything else that is connected with that. I mean, Scott mentioned the pepper spraying of open streets, and that was horrible. Has anybody else seen anything else that's gone on with police brutality in Occupy?
They sprayed the old lady, there was, like beating people who were bound, I just don't, there's tons.
There's tons. You know, I mean, we had, as you say, we had a person who survived war and came back and got his skull bashed in. We had a woman who was pepper sprayed and lost her baby because of it. And these things do not serve the state ultimately, but they keep doing it. And I think every time that happens, as Scott mentioned, Occupy gets a little bit of support because the realization is if our government is capable of doing this to them, what else are they capable of doing? And everything's kind of coming together with that. Do y'all know what the NDAA is? National Defense Authorization Act?
Is that where you can be detained indefinitely?
It's meant to be an appropriations bill, basically, for our latest in our series of undeclared wars. But woven into this legislation is language that says that the military can be used as police to apprehend and detain people on American soil. And there is language that says that this does not apply to American citizens. However, if you are declared an enemy combatant and the government is completely in charge of who is declared this, then apparently you're not an American citizen anymore. So, still, they can do this to American citizens. There's language in there that explicitly authorizes the use of torture. And there's a lot of things about this bill that are scary. There's language that says that once you are detained, there's no requirement on the part of the government to provide you with counsel or information about why you've been detained, information about your case at all. It's really frightening stuff. But this is going on right now. Another thing that's going on is that the National Labor Council, in order for it to function, it is required to have 3 members. There are 2 members, and our Congress is blocking the appointment of the 3rd member. And my understanding of the effect of this is that unions will not be able to function. They will have no bargaining power, and this takes place as of the 1st of the year. And so all of these things are converging. And I think the more the public becomes aware of this, from whether they get aware from the point of view of hearing about the NDAA or hearing about what's going on with the National Labor Council, or watching on Facebook, some college kid being pepper sprayed, or somebody having their ribs broken by a boot or a horse's hoof. This mobilizes things. So that's one thing I think Occupy has done. Another thing Occupy has done is bring into public discourse for the first time, I don't know when, the idea of class consciousness. We are the 99%. This has been an incredibly effective rallying cry, and it's been taken up by multiple organizations that might or might not be affiliated with Occupy, but they can get behind this idea that there's a big class divide, and it's meaningful, and it's getting bigger. And we talked about a little earlier today about feudal societies, and I remember thinking before my involvement in this that America was becoming a modern feudal society. I mean, I don't know about land-based or not, but the idea of a huge underclass laboring for a very small top percentage, it seems like more and more that's going on. And so this is being brought into the public consciousness. We had, okay, so I mentioned kind of 2 successful things that were on with Occupy Houston. One was simply our inauguration, and we got going. And another was the divestment march. We recently had an event that I might call sort of semi-successful. Did anybody follow the action at the port last week? There was actually an action at the port of Houston.
Did they block? Pardon me? Did they block the road?
Yeah, we blocked the road. All over the West Coast, there are problems. Well, there are problems with ports in general, right? They're a center of a lot of economic activity. Oh, and I'm sorry. That makes me think I should go back to one other thing that I think Occupy has been successful in doing, and that is bringing into question the notion of whether capitalism is what it should be. And I think capitalism has been sacrosanct in this country. And I have a friend who is both a socialist and an atheist, and he says, his joke is, I don't know why people hate me more. It's easily divided, especially in Texas. But it's becoming less scary if you're socialist to call yourself a socialist. And in fact, the primary message smiths of the right have told right leaders to stop talking about capitalism and start talking about entrepreneurship. You know, it's no longer an absolute given that capitalism is great and fantastic and works exactly the way it should and is the best way to go. So these things at all, if Occupy were to cease to exist tomorrow, the fact that these three things have happened, if it means that the movement has been successful. I don't think it's going to go away. We're kind of in phase 2 right now. This is a movement in its infancy, and criticism has been levied against it for having not had a clear message. You know, okay, fine, you're against these things, what are you for? What are you for? That's accurate, but I don't think it's important. I mean, we've been in existence for less than half a year. And in fact, Houston's been in existence for less than 3 months. So the fact that we haven't come out with definitive things on exactly what we want to change, how yet, I think that's perfectly fine. And it has to go in that direction to have effect. But things take time. And the fact that it is still in its infancy and it's still growing and it's still conceptualizing itself and it's still getting people on board, that's all as it should be. Now, to go back to the port action. This is part of us figuring out, you know, who we are and how we're going to function. West Coast ports, their longshore workers are paid very poorly. Their truck drivers are paid very poorly. I think the statistic on the truck drivers is frequently $50 a day, out of which they have to pay for insurance and gas and everything else. So it's barely a living wage, if that. The longshore workers in those areas, I believe they are restrained from direct action unless they are in contract negotiations. There's a lot they can't do. So the occupations in those areas kind of took it upon themselves. This is an issue that matters. We're going to do something about it. And so last Monday was a day of shutting down ports. Occupy Houston came along on board in solidarity with the West Coast. Now, I call it a semi-successful action because it was a little bit muddled. Yes, we wanted to express our solidarity with what was going on the West Coast because, I mean, for a few reasons. First of all, you can argue, I think very validly, what's going on in one place is going to affect us all. You know, you can argue that it's a sign of a systemic problem, which it is. And also, we ended up tying it to things that were going on locally that shouldn't be going on. Our port authority, which is the governing body for the port, acts way more autonomously than it should. They kind of almost consider themselves a freestanding corporation rather than arm of the government. And they're kind of treated as such. The CEO of the Port Authority makes more money than any local government official in the city, more than our mayor does by a long shot. At this port, people who are on the board have used port resources, official port resources, in private capacities, like they've thrown parties for their friends. The chairman of the board had a paid position with a company that had deep ties to Libya. And after accepting this position, the Port Authority started acting in ways that favored Libya, including doing kind of a thorough review of Libyan ports. I mean, this sort of conflict of interest thing it goes on all the time in our government, and it's horrible. And how do you stop this? You know, how do you shine the light on it? So, kind of a muddled action, but successful in that we succeeded in getting a fair amount of coverage, which is good because at this point, would you say it's true if you're going to have something like a rally or a march, then one of the best things to come out of it is kind of public awareness? Yeah, I mean, because a march isn't going to change policy, right? But it might get people to understand their issues at stake that you care about. And we got coverage in the major media in Houston, surprisingly positive coverage, except of course for Fox. That's okay, we'll never get them on board. And worldwide, it was a very successful event. In fact, a Japanese occupation, I think it was I think it was Occupy Kyoto, shut down their port in Japan in solidarity with what was going on the west coast of America. But that's what's going on. I think we think of the Occupy movement as an American thing, but it's not. There's Occupy London, there's Occupy Kyoto. Occupy Bucharest came out with a statement against the NDAA. This is a spider web that's growing. And what we grow into, I'm not sure. I mentioned the primary criticism that's going on about Occupy right now is that we don't have a clear objective. And that's true, but that's in the process of being changed. There are more probably valid criticisms. One is that there is a certain amount of gender and racial disparity in our makeup. Apparently, 20% of occupiers are women, which is, of course, not reflective of what what America's like. Over 50% are women, right? Most tend to be white. That's not entirely the case. We have a lot of occupiers down there who are Black or who are Latino, and who are working in their communities and trying to bring their community organizations on board. But generally, this still remains true. So we have to figure out how do we address these problems. There's a big problem with organization. If you've heard about Occupy, you've probably heard the phrase leaderless movement. And I think this movement is A, young enough, and B, populated enough by people who have never been activists before, that we are having birth pains in coming up with what it means to not have a top-down, imposed from above structure, and yet have some sort of structure that enables us to be effective. So these are the kinds of issues we're struggling with. But the fact that we're struggling with it, I don't think makes it true that we're currently unsuccessful or that we have to be unsuccessful. It simply means that, like any birth process, it's messy and painful, but that hopefully something good will come out of it in the end. I don't know if I'm kind of linking things the way you're doing.
Ideally, you and Scott would have been here like the last class, so we could have kind of taken it temporarily. And I think if we had talked more about like the civil rights and things like that, a lot of the stuff you said, I think would have been even more, kind of recognizable. Like one thing the civil rights movement think about is you have major actions, the Montgomery boycott, the Birmingham boycott, and they were directed at specific that city, the buses in Montgomery or the businesses in Birmingham, but they had transcendent meaning. And I don't know if you agree with this. You see Occupy in the same way. I mean, you're in Houston and you're trying to reach the people of Houston, but that's not really the goal. The goal is just to participate in this much larger transcendent thing.
Sure. I think this ties into that phrase, think globally, act locally. Because I can't push a button and affect something on the other side of the world, but I can directly affect what goes on in my community, in my neighborhood, and all of these together have ripple effects and meaningful ripple effects, just transcendent effects.
Yeah, and I think people don't realize, outside of Wall Street, you can make a strong case that this is kind of one of the epicenters of capitalism in the world globally. And it's the second biggest port, I believe, in the U.S. after LA. Is that right, Scott? Houston's the second biggest port.
In terms of commercial activity.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the global capital for oil and energy, chemicals, petrochemicals, NASA, the health center. I mean, this is truly a global economic city. And so
we have a lot of headquarters of a lot of multinationals here. Commerce here is huge. Industry here is huge, and the effects of those facts are huge. Around our port is basically this ring of poison. We have heavy industry going on right next door to where people live, and one of the ramifications of this is that if your kid goes to school and one of the schools right near the port, they have a 58% greater likelihood than other children of being diagnosed with leukemia. And we've known this since at least, I think it was 2007, UT Commission did the study that came out with this. We have laws on the books that could address this, at least partially, because they have to do with the emissions of these factories, and yet these laws are not enforced. They can be enforced on the state level or not, they can be enforced on the county level or not, they can be enforced on the local level, and they're not. And it has to be the fact that the corporations that are there have huge pull in our city, huge pull in our state, huge pull in our county, just like corporations have huge pull in our country. Well, I mean, was anybody else offended when our government started using, government officials started using the phrase clean coal? Right? I mean, the fact that they could even have those words come out of their mouth, I think, is just a sign of how in bed the coal industry and our elected officials are. And
Did anybody here go to Cesar Chavez High, or you know anything about it? It was built on a toxic waste dump, literally. And I mean, they've been serious health problems. And there's also, Houston, they have the highest asthma rate in the country.
it's huge.
So,
yeah.
I mean, this really is, and that was now, on a personal level, I know, like I grew up in the 60s. I was young at the time, and that meant a lot to me, and that's kind of what propelled me. I mean, I was kind of aware of that from the start. And I think a lot of people kind of get motivated by that. I mean, in your case, you had mentioned, you kind of did these personal actions. But I mean, in doing Occupy, do you think back, I mean, like how this fits into a larger framework of protest in America, civil rights? I mean, do you think about like where you fit within that, or is there something in that you find like as useful or inspirational or anything like that?
Do I find the history of protest?
Like, Scott talked about Earth First and how he kind of came through this. Do you think Occupy, or you personally have anything like that or did you just kind of come to this as I don't want to use the word blank slate because that has too many negative connotations,
Sure,
but you know what I mean by that.
Me personally, I mean, I have at least this sort of cultural knowledge of protest movements in the country that anybody does. I know what Rosa Parks is, I understand kind of the general progression of the 60s civil rights movements, but it's not something I've studied. And so, insofar as, I'd say I kind of come to this pretty naively. And one of the reasons I kind of started with my personal story is not because my personal story is particularly important, but because there is such a variety of personal stories coming into this movement. And one thing that's really interesting is, I grew up poor. I grew up in a trailer park, but I did really well in school, and I went to a fantastic college. And even though I've never made money, that has never been my goal, I live a middle class life, and I have middle class friends. My friends are graphic designers, and they're computer scientists, and they're teachers. And through the Occupy movement, I have met people who are homeless. I mean, really, like that's where they've been for the last couple of years, but somehow are more functional than some homeless people are, and come on board and are trying to do something. I've met people who dropped out of school and have signed on to this and are trying to do something. I've met people who are more sort of situated like I am, and they come after work and they're trying to do something. So it's interesting. I have had my social horizons broadened immensely by this. And there are just such a variety of personal stories that lead people onto this. Let me mention before I forget, Occupy Houston has 1,000 copies of the Occupy Wall Street Journal that we're distributing sort of through the state. And I would love for you guys to take copies for yourselves, and if you think there's any place where you can leave a stack, please do that as well. We also do our own newspaper, Occupy Houston paper. We have another issue coming up pretty soon. I hope some of you might be interested enough that if you haven't already, you kind of check us out on Facebook, interface with us, see what's going on. One of the good things about the way we're situated, as I've said, there's legitimate criticism about kind of lack of organization, but there's also a real desire for inclusivity and democracy. And so if you come and you have definite opinions and you have things that you want to see done, and if you're respectful enough of other people that you can, put that forth in a way that other people can listen to, there's a good chance that your voice is going to make a real difference. So I hope to maybe see some of those faces out there. But are there any questions? I would love to answer.
This might be an obvious question, but do you find it particularly challenging to gain support in a city like Houston compared to like other more liberal, like Austin or something, being the oil and gas communities?
Let me preface this by saying that I have not had success, or I have not had any kind of experience being in other cities, so I don't have a direct comparison. But from what I've seen, Occupy Houston is actually a little little more functional than Occupy Austin is, which I wouldn't have expected to be the case. You know, we all know how liberal Austin is. But I think, I think Houston has such evil things going on that you have people understanding from the get-go there are things happening in our city that shouldn't be happening, and so maybe those people are a little easier to mobilize. Any other questions?
Where are you guys right now? Are you still in Tranquility Park or?
We still exist in Tranquility Park. That is another source of contention. From the beginning, there has been a tension between the resources, including sheer will and effort and time required to maintain a physical occupation, and the desire to go out and do the activities and the work that we've gone on board for, which is not to camp somewhere, but to make systemic change happen. So there's a side of us who would love to see that occupation go away. And then there's another side of us who says, hey, we're actually helping homeless people out here who are part of us, or who maybe aren't part of us, but they still need to be fed and what have you. And it is in our principles that we need to include these people. So this is kind of a dichotomy. It still exists. Occupations all over the nation are being booted out, and I don't know if and when Houston will fall for that. But if we do, I still think things will continue.
Just out of curiosity, I'm guessing you guys are majority of you guys are funded by just donations and things like that. Do you also have private companies that have donated to the movement, or have you heard of anything like that?
I haven't heard of any companies who have donated to the movement. Like there's a rich guy who started Occupy Supply, and what he does is he's making clothing and kind of donating it in batches to different occupations. So I suppose that's a corporate donation, but I think that's as corporate as we've gotten. Now the movement as a whole, some people have accepted help in certain ways from unions. Some people have been very leery of this. There's a history of co-option by centrist organizations, which at this point I would put labor as, of leftist movements. And so there are some occupations who have kind of declared, basically, we respect the work that the union's doing, we will not accept direct aid because this might put us beholden to them. We in Houston have not had this experience. In fact, unions have kind of signed on, been very supportive. We've done cooperative ventures together. Not too long ago, we shut down a bridge in downtown, and I say we, it was really organized by SEIU, by the union, but a lot of occupiers signed on to it. So I mention that even though we asked about corporations, because the same sort of concerns exist.
I was actually going to ask both you and Scott, but mentioned to talk about that issue of either call it co-optation or call it kind of coordination with other groups, because we're about to enter a period in class where I'm going to talk about labor extensively for like the next half century. You know, this is an era of violent labor unrest. And now it's much harder to kind of talk about the unions. Private union membership is below 10%. But there is a group, especially SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, which is pretty active. They're kind of a throwback in some ways. And I know
It's the biggest union.
it's the biggest. And you, what's that?
It's the biggest and fastest growing union in the country.
I thought Aspen was bigger.
I think that's good.
No, actually NEA is bigger, the teachers. But at any rate, do you have kind of issues like with the you've talked about the green, when you talk about Big Green, the environmental groups, because everybody kind of tends to lump this together. And RAN and Sierra Club, or even Greenpeace anymore, which Greenpeace started out as kind of the most radical group, and they had that reputation.
And they're the ones who started a lot of them.
And you can come up here if you want, but you can, maybe you could both talk about. I think we would agree that the more people on board, the better. I don't think anybody could disagree with that. And so how do you make that fit? Where, is it okay to take aid from a union as so long as they don't have this voice? I know MoveOn.org is, if you're familiar with that, it's a liberal group. It was basically a pro-Obama group. It still is basically. And even Obama and the White House and the Democratic Party themselves are trying to kind of latch on and adopt this rhetoric. And I know there's a great distance from that. This is not in any way a pro-Obama or pro-Democratic Party movement occupied. And so if you two could just talk about both in the environmental movement and what you see, like how you work with other groups to try to create something that's larger, and especially in your case with labor and your
base with Big Green? Because that's what we're going to be talking about in class.
I'll go first because it's gonna be short. We're still figuring out how to work with other groups. I mean, we are so new that we don't have processes in place for this. In fact, one of the next things I'm gonna do at the next General Assembly I'm gonna go to is propose that we put forth a kind of declaration generally outlining the facts that we want to work with other groups. We feel that there's strength and unity and that we will not be co-opted. Because it's time for us to start putting forth our positions in a kind of rather concrete way. And I think that's one of the next positions that needs to be identified and articulated.
So, I guess the best. So there's a landscape that's the environmental movement, and there's like big greens that have big, massive budgets, like $120 million to environmental defense. And at least the network and the groups of people I work with, I mean, we've kind of broken down this landscape of like different sorts of groups. And there's actually some of these big green groups which I actually consider to be the bad guys, right? They're people who take corporate donations, they have big corporate hedge fund managers sitting on their boards who invest in companies like Massey Energy, and I consider them to be bad guys. And part of the reason that they're bad guys is they actually spend a lot of time doing what we call, as a term we use called greenwashing, where these companies like Shell and BP will give money to, and these are horrible companies which do, you know, environmental injustice and they do human rights abuses and things like that, but they give money to these big greens, and these big greens give them human rights awards and environmental awards and basically make them look like soft green friendly kind of companies. There was actually a British online media outlet which did a little bit of an undercover action on one of the big greens, one called Conservation International, and they posed as a lobbyist for Lockheed Martin, I believe. And they said, and they sat down with this folks from Conservation International, and they said, hey, how can we better green our image? And they said, and they came out and they just did a brainstorm. It was all on their undercover video. They did things like, oh, we can recycle bomb fragments and things like that. And they went out on the internet and Conservation International is like one of the worst of the worst. But then there's also kind of big greens, which I actually don't think are the bad guys. They have bureaucratic problems and they spend a lot of money, not wisely. I put Sierra Club and Greenpeace in that. And my organization, Rainforest Action Network, is much smaller, where Greenpeace has a $28 million a year budget, RAND has like a $4 million a year budget. But Greenpeace actually does a lot of good work. They do a lot of like kind of sharing of those resources. And so, I mean, it's complicated. This is a landscape where we have some people who I think are the bad guys, and some guys who I think are just like really kind of inefficient. And then there's those who don't have really any resources or power, but they have like a self-righteous ideology, which I also find frustrating. And the Rising Tide North America, the kind of group I volunteer with quite a bit, actually has a pretty big critique of the big greens. Because we feel like they do a lot of kind of, they're a bit of apologists for like the business sector. And then the other thing I actually will say about labor and community organizations with the Occupy movement is that there's groups which are meeting now. And because the other big player in this besides labor are these kind of community organizations. Like a few years ago, there was a big group which kind of went under called ACORN, which was an association of community organizations. And so, but there's post-ACORN groups which are still existing. And they actually are doing a lot with the Occupy movement in other parts of the country, particularly in California and the Northeast. There's another community organization which has been around since the 70s called National People's Action. And so labor and these community orgs, and now recently some environmental groups, are actually sitting down having strategy sessions on not just how to get banks to start doing the right thing, like with their transactions, and it's like, but actually how to really kind of start having like some transformational change, which we really need to see, which is a systemic change. And the Occupy movement needs to be part of those conversations, although they're not, which I find frustrating. But they're the impetus of why it's going to happen. Questions?
So when you were protesting the port, what kind of support did you get from the unions here when you blocked it? Were they already there? Or?
Like I said, this was a little bit of a muddled action. Our longshore workers are extremely well paid. They're either the best paid or among the best paid in the country. Which is why we focused on dysfunction within the Port Authority. Dysfunction within the Port Authority, solidarity with the West Coast, and and not exactly what was going on union-wise. We threw this together extremely quickly. I think maybe within 5 days. It might have been a little bit longer than that, but it wasn't much. We had occupiers from Austin, Dallas, and San Antonio, and maybe some other places come down. We had altogether about 100 people, and that's who was there. There was no union participation. We did not reach out to the unions in that case, and part of the reason was because that wasn't a union issue. And just as a little side issue, I found out in a text a few minutes ago. This thing, I don't know what you call it. What do you call that? Yeah.
I call it it's a barrel that's been modified as a box.
The lockbox. So some folks came down with lockboxes, PVC pipes with the bars in the middle.
Which is what this is right here.
And the point of that is to make it more difficult for the police to detach you when you're in the road blocking whatever it is you're blocking. The people who were blocking the streets, who were using that, were charged with a felony, use of a criminal instrument, manufacture of a criminal instrument, piece of PVC pipe. Charged with a felony rather than a misdemeanor, which is what blocking the street typically is. Got thrown out by the judge, and our district attorney decided to convene a grand jury to reinstitute the felony charges, and that just got, they just got indicted on those like about an hour ago.
Is that like this still?
What's that?
Is it still Pat like this?
Yeah, today at least, she's still in the
Today,
DA.
tomorrow.
We don't know who knows, yeah, right. I mean, and this is one of the things we'll talk about. I mean, like I said, how the court said that the unions in Philadelphia in the 1840s were guilty of conspiracy for higher wages. I mean, it's a form of harassment, and that's what this is. I think these things have always been thrown out, haven't they? I mean,
In Houston, they've been thrown out.
yeah.
This charge is not the first time that activists using things like PVC pipe to lock themselves together have been charged with this, and it always gets thrown out and dropped.
Yeah.
It's an intimidation.
It's
It's an
harassment.
It's a tool of intimidation.
And you're going to see that time and again where you just make, I mean, Occupy or Rand, it's hard to compete with the resources. You can't compete with the resources of the state and the corporate state. And so they can grind you down.
Can I throw something out there really quick? Which is, we actually operate with an idea of what we call the battle of the story, which is too often protest groups actually get to this like conversation with the public or whoever, which is the cops versus the protesters. And that's actually been fairly successful for the Occupy movement. But the more important thing that we like to kind of continually talk about is not so much what happens on the street or what protest or who gets beat up or who gets charged with what, but we like to actually talk more about the issue. And so like the issue around Occupy is, and you're saying that the critique is that there's been no clear demands or clear objectives, which I actually disagree with. I actually feel like that's a noise that the mainstream media is making. The clear objective is that there's a really big problem with corporate power in our country and with the kind of corporate capitalist system in which we live under, and that's what people with the Occupy movement are saying. And it's just, I mean, I'm all about solidarity and working to get people out of like crazy charges, but I also want to say that the kind of message of what people did at the port last week and what people did when they shut the port down in Oakland and shut the port down in Portland, which is actually what happened, is that we need to have a critique of the system in which we're living in. And we want to like there's the story of the battle, which is what the cops versus the protesters are, and there's the battle of the story, which is where we want to like push our issue, right? The Fox News and whoever else wants to tell a story about how we're a bunch of like scruffy ruffians who just get felony charges, but we want to tell a story. It's like corporations have too much power in our society, and there's a lot of unemployed people without health insurance, and people who are homeless.
And I think that dialogue is happening more than it has. Can I ask you guys to help me out with something? We're figuring out an action on January 20th. We have a title, and the title is Occupy the Courts, and we're trying to kind of figure out how to conceptualize this action. And there have been kind of two phrases that have been thrown out, and I wonder which of these two phrases has more resonance. And one of the phrases is corporate power, and the other phrase is corporate personhood. So I'm going to ask you to kind of raise your hand, for whatever reason, what resonates more to you, makes you interested, makes you angry, whatever. So the first would be It's corporate personhood and corporate power. So the first is corporate power. Who does that sit more with?
Corporate power.
And everybody, please raise your hands. We need help with this. What about corporate personhood?
So you proved Scott and me wrong.
It doesn't make sense, it's wrong.
Like, how is a corporation person?
Corporate power is more of like a general, I mean, that's really a very general concept. Corporate personhood is specific, and like you said, it's kind of unnatural. It's like rock personhood, or like
If you put corporate
car
personhood and then
personhood.
a question mark, because
Yeah.
the whole conversation about, corporations are people and all that kind of stuff, but if you put a question mark on it, that's applying that term. Which a lot of people don't like.
I know, we're the two old men.
Any other questions?
I bow before you. Anybody else? I can't offer enough praise for Scott and Amy. Like I said, they're not just personal friends, but the work they do is just crucial and central to what a lot of people, I think, believe in. And it's easy to get frustrated and cynical and depressed and discouraged. And seeing people like this out there makes me a little less cynical and dispirited and frustrated and discouraged. So they're amazing folks. And I would assume either of you would have any problem if I put like contact information on the class page. So if you want to get a hold of either one of you.
We actually have a sign-up sheet.
Yeah, there's a sign-up sheet. I cannot endorse this as an employee of the state of Texas, but whatever. Yes, but whatever you want to do is follow the dictates of your conscience, and feel free to ask them anything.
And by the way, some folks who are active with Occupy Houston and who are U of H students are getting together to organize Occupy U of H. So, coming to a campus near you.
Thank you.
And I will see every one of you on Thursday morning, right? And read Brent Rose, watch Rads too, all right?